This is House Planning Help, episode 47. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're looking to build or remodel a property. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century. My personal objective is to create an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. And coming up in this session, my guest is McKay from BBM Sustainable Design. We're looking at how you go about choosing the right property to eco-retrofit, or hopefully something that's not going to cost you a fortune or be incredibly complicated. That's the idea behind this episode. We'll launch straight into that, but I do have a quick iTunes review and also a big thank you to Jim Online 99, because these iTunes reviews, they really do give me a boost. And I can remember it was right at the end of the week. I was just thinking, I've got so much to do. Everything's starting to get on top of me. And then I read this and think, awesome. This is why I'm doing this. This keeps me motivated. I've been downloading this podcast eagerly since it first started. It's packed with useful information from a wide range of industry experts and is presented in a very interesting format and pitched at an understandable level for a wide audience. I have learned a lot and welcome the new weekly format. Well done again, Ben. Great effort. Jim Online 99, thank you very much. Really appreciate that. Let's get to our interview. As I mentioned, it's McKay from BBM Sustainable Design today, and I think you're really going to find this useful because is there such a thing as a house that is ripe for retrofit? And if so, how do we find it? Well, Ian is going to share his experience with us, and I started by asking him for a little bit of background and also how he developed the company.
Well, BBM Sustainable Design, we've been going for 20 years. We won a competition back in fact, it was 1993 for a House of the Future, which got built in Milton Keynes. And in 1994, 20 years ago this May, it opened to the public. And it sort of set a scene for how we should be thinking about building houses in a housing expo, as it was, into the future. So it kind of was anticipating all sorts of new technologies which were emerging at the time, materials which were more environmentally benign than perhaps a lot of the supply chain was providing us with at the time. We were also suggesting ways in which people perhaps in their lifestyles could be using less resources. So we had a special home working environment. And it's quite interesting looking back how many of those sort of ideas have sort of come to fruition and what was pie in the sky. And actually not very much of it was pie in the sky. And the only things really looking back that were out of kilter was perhaps the timelines, and they're shorter. All the things that we said were going to happen have happened, but they've happened much quicker, of course, with global warming and some of the accelerated changes that we've seen, how governments and so forth have had to take up this cause to get the economy off carbon and things like that.
I'm interested in retrofit because to me, it seems that as a client, it's very complex. There's a lot to take on board, and it'd be nice just to say, we'll have our upgrade, happy days. And it never quite seems to work like that. So first up, I'd like your definition of what a retrofit is and what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's good to clarify what people mean when they talk about eco-retrofit. I mean, it's a phrase which people are banding around rather a lot. I mean, I've heard low-carbon refurbishment, or basically it's just a way of taking an existing building and reducing its energy demand to make it comfortable during the extremes of weather and so forth. So you are looking at, in particular, adding insulation, of course, to the building, or making sure the windows are nice and airtight and insulative in their own right. You're looking at maybe the heating sources, making sure they're as efficient as can be. And that's before you start looking at sort of like the obviously green things like putting solar panels onto the roof. The key thing is about sort of minimizing the energy demand rather than thinking about how you're going to make the energy. And that's what we sort of try and aim our eggs at.
Particularly, I'm interested today that you've got me as a client before I've bought a property that I would like to retrofit. And perhaps it's because I can't find the plot where I would like to build. So I am thinking of going down this route. So when I start out, we often, as clients, we want a payback in this. I know it doesn't always work exactly like that, but are there any considerations that we should have in our mind right at the very beginning of how can we make this so that it will pay back as soon as possible? Yeah,
I think that's a really good question, because I think if you choose the right building, the right candidate building to start with, you're a lot of the way there. A lot of people are coming to us with very large Victorian buildings out in the countryside. They've got fossil fuel heating. You're talking about sort of £7,000 or £8,000 a year to heat this place. Very complex forms, lots of roof shapes, lots of little bay windows, some very fussy architectural features. Beautiful building, but incredibly expensive to eco-retrofit, either putting an insulation jacket on the outside or on the inside of a building. And some buildings are just cheaper to treat than others. And I did a project for my family 2 years ago, whereby it's basically like a shoebox. It's a 2-story timber frame shoebox built in 1969. And we just knew immediately when we first saw the building, that's going to be cheap to treat. So we didn't have to spend too much money on making it very thermally efficient. And indeed, we got it almost carbon neutral for all in, including VAT, including the solar panels that we did put on, about £70,000. Not the sort of, £250,000 that you sometimes do see people spending on doing a low carbon refurbishment of a residential property.
Can we clarify then what we mean? Is it just a simple form? So you mentioned in that a shoebox. Is it every extra wall that's strange direction that you wouldn't want a star-shaped house is?
Oh, yeah, exactly. Well, if you speak to a quantity surveyor, the people that estimate the cost of a building, they'll always say, the cheapest buildings to make, due to surface area, are nice sort of cube-shaped buildings. Very simple shapes and geometries, but also the amount of surface area you are going to treat. So if it's a detached villa, you've got probably 4 walls and a roof and a ground floor. So a lot of surface area to insulate. If you've got a terraced property, 2 of your main walls are actually onto another heated space probably. So you only have to treat 2 end walls.
You wouldn't have to treat the intervening walls because they would lose energy into the neighbouring ones.
Well, everyone's heating their space, so you haven't got -5, next door, have you? You've got sort of, another person heating their place to, say, 20 degrees Celsius. There's virtually no energy loss unless that's a vacant property. And even then, it would never get down to outside air temperatures. Semi-detached, you've got 1 shared wall, which you wouldn't necessarily have to treat.
And that's beneficial, or does it not matter too much because we're talking about fewer materials if we go down that route because you've only got those 2 walls and presumably fewer windows to replace?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the plan form, if it's really efficient, if all the shapes are straightforward and not complicated, if the house is quite modern. Don't forget, older buildings tend to be all a little bit out of plumb. So, when you get a carpenter down there, they're looking at, oh, crikey, all the door frames are out. They're going to have to spend, maybe half an hour more hanging a door than if they're working in a modern built property where everything's still plumb and the rooms are rectilinear and it's just quicker. So that does get factored into contractors' quotations. If it's an old property, they are going to probably experience more irksome little problems as they move around.
Is there such a thing as a property that actually isn't worth investing the money into it? What stage do we think we've got to knock it down or do something else?
It's difficult to give a hard and fast on that, but very often we are seeing, and it's a little bit of a travesty, but because of the 20% VAT issue, if it's a very significant extension, for instance, and a lot of refurbishment and alterations on the inside and the eco-retrofit that we've been mentioning, then it might make sense to look at the new build option because you've got the 0% VAT with new build, but 20% with refurbishment. Now, one little loophole that people should be aware of is it's 5% VAT if it's strictly speaking just eco-retrofit, low carbon refurbishment. But if you are mixing it up with an extension or creating a loft conversion or extensive alterations in the house, which are not to do with making it energy efficient, then it makes the contract impossible to segregate out the 5% from the 20%. So the VAT man will have furrowed brows when looking at that. So the contractor has to sort of take a view on what they take on at 5% VAT. But if you can just do, strictly speaking, an eco-retrofit for it in its own right, then you should be able to get it done at 5% VAT.
You mentioned extensions there, and the ones that I have seen, retrofits, where they feel they've got this payback, it's because they've added on space. Would you agree? Is that something we should be factoring? I know, strictly speaking, it's not a retrofit, is it? If it's adding on.
That's a sort of a real estate issue, isn't it? Because the UK market, real estate agents speak in terms of the number of rooms, and that's crudely how they sort of equate value. Whereas, in other countries, you hear it a lot. People value the space that's created as well, not just the number of bedrooms. But notwithstanding, when people sort of think, okay, well, if we do a big extension, we're going to get some more rooms out of this property. So we'll get some money back in the long run when we come to sell. That's kind of, in a nutshell, how people see it. Yeah, you have to make your own evaluation. You have to make an evaluation about finding a property which is, I think, either big enough for what you need right now, doesn't need to have an extension, and then you can just concentrate on doing, like I say, that 5% VAT rated work. If you want to sort of put your mark on the building and do a nice big extension as well, and then do the energy refurbishment, I don't know, you might well run out of money.
So you could do it in 2 stages, and then you could have your 5%.
Yeah, we have recommended that to people in the past. Do 2 contracts. Do your extension first, and then do your retrofit on the old building afterwards. Yeah, it's perfectly plausible.
Good advice. When we're first looking at that building, is it worth us taking advice at that stage?
Oh, yeah, definitely. If you can bring someone along to have a look at early stages, it would be a good idea. But if you do keep in mind some of those very basic principles about, does it have any shared walls that you won't have to treat? Are the shapes easy to treat? And also the conservation area sort of issues and historic buildings. Sometimes the front elevations, you can't really touch them from the outside. Don't forget about that as well. So if you're looking in a really nice part of the town, there may be some restrictions on what you can do anyway on the front of the building. So, but if you have someone along with you, sort of, they may be able to sort of help point some of these things out for you.
Should we be avoiding that internal insulation scenario? You mentioned the Victorian facade or whatever. It's just going to be more complicated down that route. And as far as I can see, the less complicated it is, the easier it is. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, internal, external insulation, when we talk about particularly the treatment of the walls, you have to go back quite a long way, pre-20th century buildings really, before you start to get solid wall construction. So in other words, no cavity wall in the old masonry constructions. Cavities were introduced around the turn of the 19th, 20th century as a break between driving rain getting through from the outside of a wall to the inside. And later on in the century, in the 20th century, they started to insulate that cavity. But there was always an air gap between the insulation and the outer leaf of brick or whatever it might be. The problem is with solid masonry construction is that if you insulated it on the inside, the wall itself, the external wall, is staying cold and damp all through the winter. And it doesn't transpire its moisture very quickly. It hasn't got the ability to let go of that moisture. So you get frost damage, increased frost damage issues on the outside faces of the brick. And on the inside, of course, you've got a cold face up against the insulation, or maybe a small air gap between, but it's a wonderful place for mildew growth and spores of fungal growth, which is very bad for internal air quality. It's unhealthy. And if that sort of makes it out itself past the insulation, then that's trouble. And you've got to think also about how timber joists as well have to go through that zone. If you are insulating the inside face, they're going to go through the insulation from the warm side into the cold, wet brickwork, which stays damper longer. And if they're socketed into the brickwork, which is the old detail that how they did it, those joists are going to rot quicker. And it's always been a bit of an issue for older buildings. You have to replace the joist ends. But you can imagine how that's going to be accelerated. One rule of thumb, we've done a lot of research into that, because sometimes you don't have any choice but to insulate on the inside face. And one bit of recommendation I could make is try and use an insulation product which is breathable as best you can. So there's calcium silicate boards, which are quite expensive, but they breathe. And they're not the highest performing insulative wise, but they do allow moisture to come through that. It's applied directly onto the masonry face, but it allows that moisture to come through. And you put a lime plaster on the face, that also breathes. And then don't, for goodness sake, put emulsion paint on. Put a mineral-based paint onto the lime plaster, because that also breathes. If you fill up the pores with an emulsion paint, then it can't breathe anymore. But that helps to keep the wall healthy. It helps bring the moisture out of the wall into the internal heated space, and then it can ventilate that way. Another rule of thumb is don't insulate to too high a degree. If you have a very, very good U value, you're going to accentuate those problems I talked about earlier about frost damage and also the instance of having a dew point inside your construction, which is not healthy.
We had this in a Google Plus hangout the other day where I know it's a more extreme environment, but up in Toronto, it was mentioned that some people have started insulating internally and it's the same freeze-thaw process. But is it down to design? Can this be avoided in any climate if, as you say, you're thinking not too much insulation because we got to keep that wall?
Yes, to an extent. I mean, there's a whole raft of issues. I mean, when we did the retrofit I was talking about earlier, the one we did for my family, that was a timber frame house, and we insulated from the inside. We took the old plasterboard off. We actually built in the walls a little bit. So we increased the depth of the studs up to 150 mil. And then we filled it with sheep's wool. So that breathes. That's a nice breathing insulation. But that construction was originally designed to breathe to the outside. So it's got a cladding panel on the outside, and there's a ventilation path behind that cladding. So it all breathes to the outside anyway. Timber frame allows you to do that. I imagine some Canadian house types, they build more in timber frame out there. But over here, where you have masonry construction far more, insulating on the inside is always problematic. So if you can, try and insulate on the outside.
Are there any particular materials or construction types that will make this job easier, or does it not really matter?
Well, it's not an easy question to answer, because for each instance you're going to have a different solution. So you might have a suspended timber floor. There are techniques for insulating a suspended timber floor which are relatively cheap to do. Slightly more complicated if you've got to insulate a ground-bearing slab. What do you do about a big lump of concrete which has got no insulation on it? What we did was we put a little bit of perimeter insulation around that 1960s built house. It had no screed. It just had a power-floated concrete slab and very low ceiling height, so we couldn't build on top. But when we dug this perimeter channel of insulation at the edge of the slab before it hit the outer wall, it made a little thermal break. And then we made the decision to use 8 millimeters of cork right across the ground floor, which itself is an insulative material, and it's also what we walk on. It's a beautiful finish. So we've revalued and revisited cork, which went out of fashion in the 1970s. Another solution for the ground floor, where we had a ground-bearing slab, was when we had very high ceilings, and we made a calculation that if we lifted just 4 internal doors, about 170 millimeters, which is the same height as the first step on the staircase, we could insulate right up to that first step, raise the newel post at the bottom as if it was never there before. And that was the way we insulated a ground-bearing slab to a very high level on a very old Victorian property, which had a ground-bearing slab. But yeah, it's a tricky question. You could go around the building, look at different wall solutions, different roof solutions, but everything has to be taken into consideration. So going back to one of your earlier questions about should you take advice from someone early on when you're evaluating a house that you should possibly buy, that's the sort of key area which needs to be looked at. You know, how could you treat these different technical situations?
I often look at certain buildings, council flats, whatever they might be, but they're in a very good location. Are they ripe for retrofit, or does a certain amount of it depend on how they've been built?
When you say a council flat, so like in a block?
Perhaps not a block, perhaps council detached houses, but ones that were built some time ago, so 40, 50, 60 years ago, so they're ready for something to happen to them, and perhaps the room sizes are not bad, but they got a core location in the town or the village.
Yeah. Well, usually of that sort of period, they were building quite simply and very economically. You've got your good rectilinear and square shapes and plans, and the walls will be true. So the contractor's not going to be concerned that they're going to have, to spend hours and hours and hours getting that wall just right, and the tiling's going to work easily and all that sort of thing. Also, I suppose, is they're going to be much more open to being treated on the outside. One of the really exciting opportunities is giving an old house. We did one about 8 years ago on a house in Hove, which wasn't a particularly good-looking house. We were sort of charged with sort of turning it around, doing an eco retrofit on this house, and turning it into a really sexy and desirable building. And so people are amazed when we say the old building is still under there, that it's still there. So we completely changed the look of this building, slightly changed the roof profile, changed how some of the glazing worked on the building, and we gave it a new insulative coat on the outside, a new cladding, and it turned it from being a very dour late 50s villa into quite a swanky house for the 21st century. So that's an opportunity. And when you go into those old 1950s or 60s council-built properties, they're probably sort of aching for something, a treatment like that. And if you're in a street, you can sort of perhaps start to agree with neighbours about all doing it. We've done a trial of that, in fact, we did a street-wide study, only hypothetical. But what if the whole street did an overcladding of their house? The terrace in question was quite small, unit sizes. The rooms were small, so an internal insulating job on that would have been really noticeable on the inside rooms. So insulating on the outside was the only reasonable thing to look at. But it would need to have a very concerted effort from the whole street to do it well. I think also if you have got a contractor that can sort of do a whole street, you're looking at really, really making the numbers work much better because of the savings in buying in bulk and so forth.
Ian, this may be a good point to bring in a couple of examples. And the Nook was very different because it was a period property. And again, I suppose although we've been searching for ideal properties to retrofit, we may just think, I've got to retrofit here. So lead us through that example.
The Nook was a different kettle of fish entirely. Yeah, built in sort of the 1890s. It's solid wall construction. It was in a conservation area, so the front of the house was very... It had some sort of value to the local planning authority, although I'm still scratching my head as to what is so valuable about it. It's a villa as well, so it had 4 complete outer walls as well as its roof and ground floor. So we had to treat the inside elevation because of the architectural features with the 2 bays. We had to treat that on the inside face. And so that elevation is not insulated quite as well as the 3 side and back elevations, which are treated from the outside. But it hardly looks, if you see the building, you won't notice it actually having been treated from before and after that, which is why if you see the website, you'll see the before shot and the after shot. And it's so difficult to tell the difference. But it was very expensive to do. It was, I think, although the contractor did it for as cheap as they possibly could, it was about 130,000, and that was just for treating the external fabric of the building, really. It did get a new boiler, and it did get a mechanical ventilation system with heat recovery. But you can see where the differences in cost come.
And I guess you look at that at the end of the day and think, was it worth the investment, or someone new coming to repeat that? Have you had anyone else who's wanted to go down that route?
Well, it's a house in multiple occupation and run by 2 peers housing co-op, and their bills have come down enormously as well. And on the heating, it's sort of achieved and exceeded the performance. On electrical use, we didn't have that much control over it, slightly not as we planned or predicted. But it achieved the target for the Retrofit the Future program, which was that roughly around that 17 kilograms of carbon per annum per meter squared. So from that point of view, it's good. But it's the cost benefit analysis of that is going to be a bit of a stumbling block for a lot of people. To achieve that level of performance, it's a lot of money to spend. So that's why this other project built in the 60s with a flat roof and it's basically a shoebox terrace, it's a much cheaper property to treat and to achieve that sort of all-important affordable warmth.
That's a good comparison. I like that. But I have one more question about the old housing stock. Is there ever a line of where we shouldn't touch these buildings? Clearly, in the UK, we have listing, so we're not going to be completely refacing those. But is there any theoretical line, or is it down to each and every one of us?
I do think there is a case for evaluating a large amount of area to be sort of, whether or not we should be trying to keep these houses. If they are really uneconomic to treat and to be able to allow people to live comfortably without sort of busting the budget, because even middle income earners are now struggling to heat their properties. It's a financial burden and it's going to increase. So I think we do need to sort of rethink about quite large areas of our towns and cities and say, well, I think these houses over here, they're just going to be sort of uneconomic to treat. And we possibly ought to be thinking about renewal on quite large scale. But of course, that's a big commitment and a lot of money, obviously, which would have to be put up. But what we mustn't do is be designing new buildings which are just as energy ignorant, if you like, as the old buildings. That would be a disaster.
Well, Ian, thank you very much. We've had some great information today. Really appreciate that.
Oh, you're very welcome. I really enjoyed it.
Find out more about Ian in our show notes today. We've also got a link across to BBM Sustainable Design. One thing you ought to do if you're checking them out is go and have a look at their project archive, because it's huge. It's got lots of varied projects and I think you'll be there for a while. But in our show notes, we've got photos of the projects that we've mentioned today. And also you can leave comments at the bottom, or if you have a question, we'll try and get that answered. So houseplanninghelp.com/47. Now, I haven't done this for a while. Plug Regen Media, which is my company. I'm trying to focus it more on the construction industry and the environmental space, and we are doing more projects like that. So if you're a business that's looking for content marketing, or you're realising that your strategy is not quite working, then that's exactly what we like to do, help companies increase the traffic that they have going to their website. And I use House Planning Help as an example because I can show you how the traffic has just gone up and up and up, and it's through content creation. That's another service that we provide mainly for the UK, but we can do some things overseas. For example, if you have editing of projects, whether it's audio or video, then we can do that, or remotely I can consult, for example, podcasting. I can help you improve your podcasts. It's a way to get ahead in the industry. So any questions or anything like that, what I've done is put a link across to Regen Media. So if you go to houseplanninghelp.com/Regen Media, REGEN Media, then that will take you across to Regen Media. Right, we're about there for today. A call to action is, if you've got value from this podcast, please tell somebody about it, whether it's word of mouth, or we've made it easy on Twitter because you can pre-populate a tweet. And if you go to houseplanninghelp.com/share, you can find out more about that. Next time, Sarah Lonsdale is my guest. She's an eco-columnist for The Telegraph, but she's also been making incremental improvements to her house. So we're going to find out more next time. Until then, take care.